Thanks, everyone. Now I'm going to introduce our amazing speaker, Katharine Hayhoe. So Katharine Hayhoe is an accomplished atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters to us here and now. She is currently the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy and is also a remarkable communicator who has received the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Prize, the United Nations Champion of the Earth Award, and been named to a number of lists, including Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People, Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Thinkers, and Fortune Magazine's World's Greatest Leaders. Her TED Talk, The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change, Talk About It, has nearly 4 million views. And her most recent book is Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. She has found the most effective way to talk about climate change is with a focused and shared values and common ground. It's the stuff we love. Her keynote will lead us through why climate change and talking about it matters and what we can do about it in Montana. So Katharine's talk will include some time for questions later. We won't be using the chat to take questions. We'll be using something called Poll EV, which Katharine will explain later. And everyone, please welcome Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you so much. It is great to be with you here tonight. And Jeannie, you're a tough act to follow. I mean, I'm not from Montana and I was wiping a tear from my eye too. So thank you so much for everything. And it's great to be with you here tonight. This is going to be a conversation between us. So I'm going to be speaking to you, but then you get to ask me your questions. And I'm going to start off by asking you questions first. So as we go along, we're going to be using Poll Everywhere for you to submit your questions to me. And I'm going to start doing that right now. Just a second here. This is how you can connect, and I put the link in the chat as well. So you can do this on your computer, or you can do it on your phone. You go to pollev.com/Katharine. You have to spell Katharine with 2 A's. That's the way I spell my name. So it's a little bit of a spelling bee that you were not expecting at this time of night. Or you could just go to pollev.com/Katharine. And when you go there, you are going to see the first question popping up to you, which is, I need you to click where you're joining us from tonight. And this is also a geography lesson, isn't it? Because there's no labels here. So you have to tell us where you are. Do you recognize where you are? And if you're not joining us from Montana, that's totally fine. What you do is you click outside the state in either direction. So if I see anybody clicking outside, that means you're joining from not inside Montana. But if you're from Montana, click where you are. Looks like we have a lot of people who are very familiar with the geography of Montana. That's good. All right. I see a few more coming in. Keep coming. Okay. I see a cluster there. Someone right on the border. It's okay if your finger isn't totally accurate. I know on your phone it's hard to get the finger in the right spot. All right. A bunch of people from the western side of the state. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to ask you another question now. And for this next question, you have to answer not with a location, but with a word. Ready? So, oh, I see some more dots still coming on. Okay, people are figuring out how to use this. That's good. That's why we're doing this now. So again, if you're just joining us, you go to pollev.com/Katharine. You can see it up at the top. Or you can go to pollev.com and then enter Katharine, but you have to make sure you spell it with 2 A's. And the link is right there in the chat as well. But now I'm going to ask you a second question. And the next question I'm going to ask you requires you to give me a word. And it is this. If you could describe yourself in one word, what word would you pick? Any word at all. Describe yourself in one word. If I picked a word, I think I would probably pick scientist. That's what I am and that's what I do. But I love creative. Hopeful. Oh, I love that too. Happy. Passionate. Good words. I love this. Wild. It's a good place to live, isn't it, in Montana? Academic. Creative. Aspirationist. Tall. Tired. Yeah, I'm with you on that one too. Excellent. A seeker, determined. Good. Mom. Science-y, I like that. Grateful, yes. Energetic, courageous. Loving, hopeful. A worker, a friend. A seeker, and an academic. I love this. These are great words. And a Montanan. Yes, absolutely. So, who we are, who we bring to the table, I'm going to be talking about, is already the perfect person to care about climate change. And if someone doesn't think they care, it isn't because they don't care about the right things. Whatever they already care about makes them the perfect person to care about climate change. And if they don't think they do, it's because they haven't connected the dots. So we don't need to turn anyone else into who we are. If we're an artist or an architect or a botanist or a rancher, we don't have to make someone else what we are to make them care about climate change. Who they already are is the perfect person to care, and we just have to help them connect the dots between what they already care about and how climate change is affecting what they already care about, and how climate solutions help whatever it is they already care about. Isn't that a big reversal? Often we just assume that we have to make people care for the same reason we do, but we don't. Whoever people are, and I love the diversity here, whoever we are already the perfect person to care. All right, so now what I'm going to do from now on throughout my whole presentation is the questions are going to be open. And what this means is at any point when you have a question, now you know where to go. Go to polev.com/Katharine and you can put in your question. You don't have to use one word. You can put in the whole question. But here's the fun part. You can keep an eye on the questions and you can upvote the questions that you most want me to answer at the end. Because I imagine there will be a lot of questions. There usually are. So upvote the ones that you want me to answer the most, and then when we get to the end, we'll pick the top upvoted questions to respond to. So this is going to stay open the whole time. If you put your questions in the chat, Jeannie or someone will remind you to take them over to PoleV. If you don't know how to do it, they can do it for you. But this is how I'm going to be taking questions the rest of the time, and you can put in your questions anytime as we go along. All right, I'm going to start off now, and I'm willing to bet you any money that you are going to be surprised with the first slide I show. So the first slide I show has nothing to do with climate change. It has everything to do with human well-being. Back in the 1700s, the most developed country in the Western Hemisphere was the UK. And back in the 1700s and even the early 1800s, the average life expectancy in the UK was 40 years. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but in full disclosure, if I had lived back then, I would more than likely be dead. 40 years was the average life expectancy back then in the wealthiest and most prosperous country in the Western Hemisphere. Today, our average life expectancy here as well as there is about 80 years old. What was responsible for the biggest change in life expectancy and human welfare in the history of humans on this planet? The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution brought us untold benefits. It was when we figured out how to dig up coal back then, and then oil and gas as well as we went along, coal and oil and gas, and burn it to power our society. And the Industrial Revolution brought us a lot of benefits. If we just stop and think about it, imagine your life without running water, without electricity, without refrigeration, without the medical advances of the last 200 years, without the ability to travel, without the all of the machinery that we take for granted that makes farming and ranching and just living possible. All of this was brought to us by the Industrial Revolution. And so I don't think it's inappropriate at all to say that I'm entirely grateful for the benefits the Industrial Revolution brought us. Our lives today are longer. They are healthier in general. They are much more comfortable, and our level of welfare is higher than it was 200 years ago. This is a picture of my grandmother, my great-grandmother, I should say, Grandma Lucy. This is Grandma Lucy in 1910. She is wearing a long dress and a big hat, and she is driving a horse and a buggy. She lived in Toronto, Canada. That's where I'm from. And 10 years later, this is the family. Grandma Lucy was taking the picture. She had short skirts, bobbed hair, and the family was in a motor car. How our lives have changed, and they have changed so quickly within generations that we know. Coal and gas and oil have brought us many benefits, and we can be grateful for those benefits, while at the same time acknowledging that today they are now costing us too much. Why is now the time? Why was any time in the last couple of decades the time to transition from the coal and gas and oil that brought us through the Industrial Revolution to new sources of energy? Well, there's many reasons. And starting with the most trivial of them, leading on to the most serious of them, first of all, we've been using coal since the Middle Ages. And just as nobody would line up to get a party line telephone these days, I actually did grow up with a party line telephone myself, believe it or not. And we would go for the new phone. In the same way, we don't need the old sources of energy when we have new sources of energy. And in fact, this is exactly what's happening around the world. Last year, during COVID, 90% of new energy installed around the world in some of the poorest places in the world was clean energy. 90% was clean energy already last year. Isn't that amazing? Fossil fuels are also too expensive. What do I mean by that? Did you know that already with current subsidies on fossil fuels, and I'll get to that in a minute, people often say, oh, clean energy, it's so heavily subsidized. No, not compared to fossil fuels, it's not. But with the current subsidies on fossil fuels, already the cheapest form of electricity in much of the middle part of the United States, including eastern Montana, is that green color, which is wind. In other places, including of all places, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Missouri, Colorado, and Arizona, the cheapest source of electricity today is solar. That's the purple. And then the orange is natural gas, combined cycle natural gas, which is much more efficient. And nowhere is coal the most affordable source of electricity today. This is already happening today. If we had a price on carbon, which restores some of the distortions in the market induced by fossil fuel subsidies, with the price that we have just over the border in Canada, this is what we would look like. And with the price that they'll have in 2030, this is what it would look like. So what do I mean by the fact that fossil fuels are heavily subsidized? Well, in the United States, fossil fuel subsidies top almost $600 billion per year, which exceeds the Pentagon's budget. Those subsidies come from taxpayer dollars. Around the world, the fossil fuel industry is subsidized to the tune of $11 million a minute, according to the International Monetary Fund. Fossil fuels are a very expensive way to get our energy today, just looking at the dollars alone. But there's a lot more to it than the dollars. We know that extracting fossil fuels uses and pollutes our water. We know that in places like the Appalachians, where mountaintop removal coal mining is practiced, that practice allows toxic heavy metals to leak into the local water supplies. So the very people who depend on coal mining for their livelihood to put food on the table, they are at higher risk of all kinds of things, from cancer to heart disease to birth defects and many other things, because of the very industry that supplies their paycheck. And then there's the fact that when we burn fossil fuels, they produce air pollution. And we can see that air pollution often hanging in the air over our cities or factories. How much does air pollution impact us? Often we tend to trivialize it. Oh, unless you live in China, it's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal in China, but it's also a big deal here. Around the world, 8.8 million people die prematurely on average every year from air pollution from fossil fuels. That is nearly double the number of premature deaths from COVID, but it's happening every year. That is a heavy price to pay for our fossil fuel use. And COVID even comes into the picture because it turns out that if our lungs are weakened from years of exposure to air pollution, then when coronavirus comes along, we're more likely to get it. And if we get it, we're more likely to get very sick or even die. So ironically, burning fossil fuels actually contributes to increased COVID risk as well. These problems that confront our world are all intertwined. And we haven't even started to talk about climate change yet. Have you noticed? Well, here we go on climate change. And this is the biggest one of all. Why? Because climate change is a threat multiplier. That's the U.S. military's term for it, not mine. Climate change takes all the other issues that we're struggling with today, whether it's issues of health or the economy, issues of water or air or soil, issues of energy or the environment. Climate change takes all of these issues and it exacerbates them or makes them worse. Climate change is not a separate bucket to put our efforts and our time and our money into. Climate change is rather the hole in the bucket of every other problem we're trying to fix. We're never going to fix it if we don't patch the hole. That's why climate change matters. So what is climate change and how does it affect us? Let's start at the beginning. We care about burning fossil fuels, first of all, because number one, their extraction pollutes our water and our soil. Number two, their combustion pollutes our air. And number three, when we burn them, they also produce heat-trapping gas emissions. Why do heat-trapping gas emissions matter? Well, first of all, remember when I said, way back at the beginning, I said, we can be grateful for the benefits that fossil fuels have brought us, but now is the time to move on. What if we had taken the energy crisis in the 1970s as an indicator to move on from fossil fuels? For a brief time, through increased efficiency, when President Carter put solar panels on the White House roof, for a brief time it looked like we were going to move on. But then everything went back to normal. What would the world have looked like if we had? Well, if you look back through history, 6% of our carbon emissions were produced from 1750 to 1900. 6%. 21% of our carbon emissions were produced from 1900 to 1970. During the oil crisis, if we had taken that as an opportunity to transition to clean sources of energy, climate change would really not be too much of a problem. But we didn't. Instead, we piled on and we doubled down, and 73% of our carbon emissions were produced since 1970. That's why we're in the problem that we're in today, is because it is too much of a good thing. Way too much. So why are carbon emissions a problem? This short video explains. It turns out that our planet, just a second here and you'll see it in just a minute. There we go. There's our happy planet. Our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases like carbon dioxide and methane. Completely natural. The sun's energy shines down and goes through this blanket like a window. The Earth absorbs the sun's energy and heats up and gives off heat energy, and the natural blanket traps the heat energy, keeping our planet over 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it would be otherwise. Without this natural blanket, our planet would be a frozen ball of ice with no life. So if this blanket is natural, which it is, and essential to life, which it is, what's the problem? The problem is that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, we have been wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, 75% of that blanket in the last 50 years. And just like you would if someone snuck into your room at night and put an extra blanket on you that you didn't need, you wake up sweating saying, hey, I didn't need this blanket. That's what's happening to our planet. And that's why it's warming. When we look at what's happened in Montana, we can see that we might have warm years or cold years. That's normal. That's just weather. But decade by decade by decade, average temperatures in Montana have been steadily ticking upwards. How else is climate change affecting Montana? Well, one of the biggest ways that we see it affecting us is not just through the change in average temperatures, but through the way it's loading the weather dice against us. What do I mean by that? Well, wherever we live, it's as if we have a pair of dice and we always have a chance of rolling a double six. A heat wave, a drought, a wildfire, a storm. But as the world is warming decade by decade by decade, it's as if it's sort of sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and turning it into a 6, taking another number, turning it into a 6, taking another and turning it into a 7. And all of a sudden, I live in Texas, in Houston, Texas, they're like, how could we have 3 500-year flood events in 3 years? Climate change is loading the weather dice against us. It is making our droughts longer and stronger and more intense. It is making our heat waves more frequent and more dangerous, like the heat wave out west this past summer that was 150 times more likely because of the impacts of a changing climate. It's causing wildfire season to begin earlier and later, and wildfires are burning greater area. And it's supersizing our storms as well. In Montana, the average summers in Billings, which I know a lot of you are from since I saw that map, the average summers in Billings, Montana would feel like the tip of Texas by the end of the century if we don't do something about climate change. And I live in Texas. And believe me, you do not want the summers in Texas. You do not want them. Spring and fall, totally fine. Summers, no. This is what we are talking about, a massive shift in the character and the nature of the places where we live if we do not heed the warnings today. What you're looking at here is not going to happen. It is what will happen if we do nothing. And just like going to the doctor and having the doctor give you a warning of what's going to happen if you do nothing, that warning is intended to say we need to act to avoid these impacts. But some of the impacts are already here today. And so we have to prepare and adapt to what we can no longer avoid because, it's not 1970 anymore. If we had taken action in the 1970s, we would not be dealing with this today. But we didn't, and so we are. Like what? Well, we know that across the whole Western United States, wildfires are a normal part of life. Without climate change, wildfires would have burned about 11 million acres across the Western U.S., just normally and naturally. So where does climate change come in? Climate change doesn't start the wildfires. Most of the wildfires across the Western U.S., not so much in Montana, but in the more populated areas, most of those are the result of arson. Accidental ignition. Only 7% are arson. Most are accidental ignition. And then in areas with less people, most of them are due to lightning. So where does climate change come in? Well, imagine that you accidentally drop a match or lightning strikes a pile of green wood. What happens? Not much. Then imagine that you accidentally drop a match into or lightning strikes a pile of bone dry kindling. What happens? A conflagration. That's the difference between with or without climate change. As it gets warmer, it's drying out the vegetation, drying out the soil. You've got bark beetles that are overwintering because the winters aren't cold enough now to kill them off, and they're eating millions of acres of trees all across Western North America. And then when the wildfire comes along, there's all these dying or dead trees for it to burn as well. So no wonder we're seeing greater area being burned. This is a figure specifically for Montana. The one I showed you before was for the whole Western U.S. This one's for Montana. You can see that some years are good and some years are bad, right? In fact, a very bad year was in the 1960s. But decade by decade by decade, these numbers are ticking up. And in fact, in Montana, there are more fires as well, not just greater area, but also more fires. This is not looking to the future. This is what's already been happening. What else is happening? Well, compounding the problem is the fact that more precipitation is falling as rain and less is falling as snow. And so snowpack has been decreasing across Montana since the 1950s. Each dot here is a snowpack observing station. And if it's red, snowpack has been going down. If it's blue, snowpack has been going up. And the size of the dot indicates the amount of change since the 1950s. So you can see that there's a couple of places where it's been going up, but most places it's been going down. In some places it's been going down more than 50%. So what does that mean? It means that there's less snowpack available, so there's less water available. And so when those wildfires come along, it's even drier than it was before, and there's less water supply because snowpack is a natural reservoir. We know that glaciers are shrinking. This is one of those before and after pictures. This is the Grinnell Glacier in Glacier National Park in 1920, and then much more recently. I hate to say this, but a number of my colleagues have been going to Glacier National Park for their summer vacations. And I've asked every single one of them when I hear from them, I hear them say that. I say, why are you going? And they say, I'm going so that my family can see the glaciers before they're gone. On average, the glaciers in Glacier National Park have shrunk, on average, by 40% already. And there'll still be some glaciers left during our lifetime. But if we don't take action, if summers in Montana end up feeling like Texas, that is definitely the end of the glaciers. That's why it's important to take action. Glacier National Park has a really good website. If you haven't seen it yet, it's really impressive. And they do a fantastic job at talking about how climate change is affecting the ice and climate change is affecting the wildfire patterns. And then they have this whole list of all the different ways climate change is affecting your hiking, your breathing, wildfire smoke choking the air so the views aren't as good. It's affecting mountain goats and wolverines. It's affecting all kinds of birds and wildflowers and fish. Climate change is affecting the character of Montana as you know it. And that's why it matters. If you live in Montana, you have every reason to care about climate change because of who you are and where you live. And of course, it's also affecting our health. There's this really good report. If you haven't checked it out yet, I strongly recommend it. Climate Change and Human Health in Montana. Climate change is not just about the health of the planet, it affects our health. I just got back from Glasgow, where one of the most inspiring contingents of people I talked to there were medical professionals, physicians, doctors. Why did they go to a climate meeting in Glasgow? To beat the drum, to say, we care about climate change because we swear an oath to do no harm. And today, climate change is directly affecting people's health, and that's why we care, and that's why we need to fix it. It is too steep a price to pay for our fossil fuels. We need clean sources of energy. Why? For all of us. So I have a little series on YouTube called Global Weirding, and in fact, I'll put a link to it in the chat if you're interested. Let's see. Here we go. It is called Global Weirding, and I have one episode for each area of the country. globalweirdingseries.com. There we go. It's in the chat right here. And so if you're interested in knowing more about how climate change is affecting the Northern Great Plains area, go to globalweirdingseries.com and check out the I Live in the Midwest and Northern Great Plains video, and it goes through even more areas that we're being affected by climate change today. But I don't want to stop there, because when we look at who is most impacted by climate change, it's even more concerning. The poorest and most vulnerable people, the 50% poorest in the world, some of whom live in Montana and Texas in the United States, but many more of whom live in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, the poorest 50% of people in the world have contributed only 7% of carbon emissions. Yet they are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the impacts. If we look at countries, climate change has already increased the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world by as much as 25%. That has already happened. And when we look at who is most affected by climate change, right here in the US, it's people who are poor, who live in low-income neighborhoods. When we look around the world, it's people who live in low-income countries. We already see that climate change is unjust. It's already exacerbating the gap between the richest and poorest people in the world. And so when we look at climate change impacts around the world, we see impacts where we live. But when we look around the world, we see even bigger impacts. Is it normal to have monsoon floods in Bangladesh? 100%, absolutely. Is it normal for a third of the entire country to be underwater 2 times in 5 years? No, that is not normal. That is climate change loading the dice against them. Is it normal for, just a second here, there we go. Are hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico normal? Absolutely. Is it normal for them to put 100,000 people on the street homeless? To destroy, almost 90% of the crops in some areas of an entire country like Haiti? No. Climate change is making hurricanes bigger and stronger. Are droughts normal in Syria? Yes. But is it normal to have drought after drought so severe that it drives 90% of farmers, or most of the farmers, into the cities where there's no employment? Employment rates are skyrocketing. Water costs more than gas for your car. And coupled with the civil unrest, it exacerbates, it doesn't cause, it exacerbates the refugee crisis. Why? Because climate change is a threat multiplier. It takes all the challenges we face, like gender equity, indigenous peoples, even racism, and it makes them worse. So that's why, as I alluded to at the very beginning, that's why I am absolutely convinced that to care about climate change, you don't have to live a certain place or care about a certain thing or even vote a certain way. You only have to be one thing, and that one thing is quite literally a human being who lives on planet Earth. If you are that person, then you have every reason to care. And if whoever you're talking to is that person, they have every reason they need to care. And if they don't think they care, it is simply because they have not connected the dots between what they already care about and how climate change is affecting it directly. And that's what you can help them do. All right. So the bottom line for this is it's not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. Instead, it is about what? It is about saving us. And that's why when I wrote my new book, I called it Saving Us. It is quite literally about us, human civilization, and many of the other living things that share this planet with us. That's what this is about. So, all right, here's the problem, but what can we do about it? How do we fix it? I don't want to leave it here. And remember, you can be putting your questions in Poll EV at any time, and you can be upvoting the questions you most want me to answer. But we're going to keep talking here for a little bit because I don't want to leave you just with the problem. I want to talk about the solutions. What do the solutions to this problem look like? First of all, we have to stop putting so much carbon into the atmosphere. Second of all, we have to take carbon out of the atmosphere because you know what? There's 100 times more carbon in the ecosystems and soil than we humans have produced since the dawn of the industrial era. And carbon in the soil, as one ag professor told me, is like Miracle Grow on steroids. And carbon in ecosystems makes them healthy. The healthier they are, the more carbon they have. But we also have to build resilience to the impacts we can no longer avoid because we have been using fossil fuels too long. We have been using fossil fuels decades past when we should have transitioned off them. And because of that now, we also have to adapt and build resilience to the impacts that are already here today. A different way of putting this is the swimming pool analogy. So picture the swimming pool as the atmosphere. The level of water in the pool is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there was a certain level of natural carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, enough for us to touch the bottom with our toes. I grew up with an above-ground swimming pool myself, and my parents always kept it at just the level so we could just touch it with our toes until we got the bottom with our toes, until we got big enough to learn how to swim. So we have had that water in the swimming pool, that CO2 in the atmosphere, at just the right level for human civilization. Until when? Until we stuck a giant hose into it by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, and we started to turn that hose up year after year after year. Last year during the pandemic, we turned it down 7%, and then we turned it right back up again, which means it had virtually no impact at all. So what do we have to do? We have to turn off the hose. What else do we have to do? We have to make the drain bigger. What's the drain? The drain is our agriculture and our ecosystems that want to take up carbon if we can help them do so. And then what else do we have to do? We have to learn how to swim because our toes are barely touching the ground anymore. And in some places, like if you've seen the news about what's happening in Vancouver right now and the agricultural areas around Vancouver, it is too late there for many people. Their homes, their farms are already being inundated and they're losing everything they have. So what do these solutions look like, practically speaking? What do climate solutions look like that stop carbon from going into the atmosphere? They look like good old-fashioned efficiency. We are very wasteful with our energy. Through efficiency alone, we could cut U.S. carbon emissions in half in the next 10 years. But it also looks like transitioning to clean sources of energy, like wind and solar and geothermal and hydro, ways to get energy that give us the energy we need without producing heat-trapping gases. What do climate solutions look like that take carbon out of the atmosphere? Well, as you know, I'm with the Nature Conservancy, and they have done so much great work on regenerative agriculture, cover crops, no-till agriculture. There's an amazing movie that just came out that I got to watch before I went to COP that's all about how farmers are climate heroes and ranchers are climate heroes. And after we're done, I'm going to put a link to that movie in the chat because it is so good. You cannot watch it without getting the hugest smile on your face. All the stories of farmers and ranchers, and they have stories from all around the world. And they even have stories of people who fish, people who herd cattle, people who farm. They truly are our climate heroes, putting that carbon back in the soil where we want it instead of the atmosphere where we don't. We can also take up carbon by restoring and protecting ecosystems, not just forests, but coastal wetlands, peatlands, and more. But we also have to learn how to swim. And that means that we need climate solutions that build resilience to help communities and systems, especially the most vulnerable, to adapt to the changes that are already here today. One of my colleagues, her name is Katharine Wilkinson. As you can see, she spells her name the same way I do. She said something that I absolutely love. She said it in a volume of women's voices on climate change called All We Can Save, and I liked it so much that I took this quote to end the last chapter in my own book. She said this: "It is a magnificent time to be alive at a moment that matters so much." That is where you and I live today. And that means that we have a tremendous responsibility, but also a tremendous opportunity to make a difference. We are not alone. Entire countries are acting, and today the Build Back Better plan actually passed through Congress, which is the biggest piece of climate legislation in the United States in a decade. It's not just countries, though. There's all kinds of big corporations like Microsoft and IKEA and Apple and Walmart who are part of the climate solution. We know that universities and colleges are part of the climate solution. University of Montana, Penn State, college students themselves. When we look at all the hands on the boulder, we see there are millions of hands on that climate action boulder rolling it down the hill faster and faster. We know that farmers and ranchers are acting in Illinois, in Montana, in Texas, where I live today. Farmers and ranchers are part of the climate solution. They're adding their hands to the boulder, and you can encourage your neighbors to add theirs too. We know that the Northern Plains Resource Council is acting, of course. Doing what? Working in ag and food and clean energy and coal and soil health. I would actually argue that climate change is not a separate action here. Why do we care about climate change? Because it affects our soil, our health, our energy, our neighbors, our ag, and our food. Why do we care about climate solutions? Because they benefit our ag, our food, our energy, our neighbors, our soil, our health, right? Climate change is this overarching issue. We care about it because of all these other things we care about, and we advocate for climate solutions because they help with all these other things that we care about. We often think of climate action as a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands on it. And then we feel like, why bother to add mine? It won't make a difference. But when we look around at all of the people whose hands are already on that boulder, we see that that boulder is in fact already at the top of the hill. It is already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It already has, and I'm sorry I couldn't find a picture of this, it already has millions of hands on it. And if you add your hand, it will go a little bit faster. And if we add our hands together, it will go that much faster. It is already heading in the right direction. We just need it to go faster. So where do we start? What's the first thing that we can do? Well, you're going to be surprised at my answer here, because my answer here has nothing to do with light bulbs or solar panels or electric cars or trucks or even permaculture or smart farming. Where do we start? We start with what catalyzes action. How does any action begin? It begins by doing the one thing that most people in the United States are not doing. Most of us are not talking about it. And so that's when I did a TED Talk, which I don't know, Jeannie, if you're able to find the link for that and put that in the chat. When I did a TED Talk, I said, I have to talk about the most important thing you can do to fight climate change. And people said, well, we already have lots of great TED Talks on electric vehicles and managed grazing and plant-rich diets. We already have all these TED Talks. I said, no. How does change happen? How do we encourage people to add their hands to that boulder? By talking about it. Now, sometimes we talk with our voice. Sometimes we talk by writing. Sometimes we talk by doing things that other people see us do. Sometimes we talk by voting. Sometimes we talk with our money. We talk in a myriad of ways, but when we talk with each other, that's how we encourage each other to add our hands. Now, how do we talk about it? Climate changes and we get worried. 70% of us are worried about climate change already in the US. 83% of moms are worried about climate change in the US. 84% of young people are worried. And when we get worried and we look around at other people and they're not doing what we think they should be doing, we think they need to be more worried. So we load up on all the scary looking facts that we can get and we dump them on them. But here's the problem. Chances are they are already worried. They just don't know what to do. Because even though 70% of us are worried, fully half of us feel helpless and hopeless when it comes to climate action. And if we feel helpless and hopeless and somebody just dumps more scary data on us, you know what happens? We just reject it even more and we freeze. This is the way our brain works. Tali Sharot is a neuroscientist. She wrote a really good book called The Influential Mind. She didn't talk about climate change at all. She just talked about how our brains work. And here's what she said. She said the human brain is wired such that fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. So when we talk about it and we just dump more scary data on people, that just makes the problem worse. So what do we talk about instead? What are we supposed to talk about then? We're supposed to talk about why and how climate change matters to us here and now in ways that matter to me as a farmer, as a rancher, as a skier, as a birder, as a hiker, as someone who lives in Montana, as a student, as a grandparent. Whoever we are, we need to start from the heart rather than the head. Start with who you are and what you're passionate about. And I love that passionate was one of the words that came out at the beginning. Start with who you are and what you're passionate about. And connect the dots to how climate change affects it, and then talk about positive, constructive things we can do to fix it. Talk about where and who and what you love. And it's not hard to come up with that if you live in Montana, but I included a picture of a beach there just in case your heart lies on a beach vacation. You can start there too, because we want there to be beaches, and if sea level rise continues unabated, there won't be a lot of beaches left. In my book, I talk about how we can begin conversations talking about how climate change affects beer or wine or coffee or chocolate, how climate change affects tennis or baseball or football or skiing, how climate change affects Montana or California or South Carolina or Texas, how climate change affects our children, how it affects our health, how it affects the economy or national security. Begin from the heart with what you care about. Connect the dots to how climate change matters to us and talk about positive, constructive solutions. And if you need more solutions beyond what the Northern Plains Council offers, Project Drawdown is a great place to look. If you don't mind putting that link in the chat there, Jeannie, it's just drawdown.org. And they have over 100 solutions to climate change, like what? Oh, sure, they have solar panels and they have efficiency and they have wind energy too, but they also have conservation agriculture, farm irrigation efficiency, nutrient management, plant-rich diets, improved crop production. There are dozens of solutions that we can engage in when it comes to climate action, and they're good news. They clean up our air and our water, enrich our soil, grow better crops. Oh, and they take up carbon too. Win, 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 win. So when we talk about climate change, just a second here, for some reason my PowerPoint has frozen on me. Hello. Oops, there we go. When we talk about climate change, oh gosh, something really weird is happening here. Just a second here. Let's take this out. Climate changes and we get worried. But here's where we break the cycle. How do we break the cycle? Instead of sharing more doom-filled facts, we share how it affects us and we share positive, constructive solutions. And you know what that does? People feel empowered and change results. As Tali Sharot says, the human brain, and again, this is neuroscience, the human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. So reframe your message so the information you provide induces what? Hope, not dread. That is how we get people to add their hand to the boulder. And once our hand is on the boulder and we look at all the people who are beside us, that continues to give us hope because we realize we are not alone. Who's the best person to talk about climate change? It's not me. I'm number 2. Scientists are number 2. Who's number 1? You. Friends and family, people you know, neighbors, colleagues, coworkers, fellow Montanans. You are the best person to talk about climate change with people who share your passion, your interests, your profession, the place where you live. If we don't talk about it, why would we care? If we don't care, why would we act? And if we don't act, how are we going to fix this thing? How does climate solutions begin? By using our voice to advocate for climate solutions, whoever we are, wherever we are. Because to care about climate change, you only have to be one thing. And that is quite literally a human being living on planet Earth. So that's why, like I said, it is a magnificent time to be alive at a moment that matters so much. Every action matters. Every choice matters. Every year matters, every bit of warming matters, every ton of carbon matters, and every single one of us has a role to play in, as I say in my book, saving us. Thank you so much. Now, I'm going to reactivate the questions here. And I see that some people have been putting questions in PolyView, which is awesome. Now, Jeannie, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Do you want to come back on with me? And do you want to pick some questions from the list that people have given us to ask?
I'm just trying to get unmuted. Sure.
Okay.
Now, but I have to figure out where I can find the question.
Oh, you can find them if you go to polyv.com/Katharine.
Okay.
And everybody, you can keep upvoting. We have 6 votes for the top question, but you can keep on going. So go ahead.
Okay, let me get, okay. So I see,
if you click on top, it ranks them by the ones that are upvoted.
So I don't see the question. I'm at, oh, top. Okay, I see.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see more responses. Okay. Okay. So you want to just start with the ones that
yeah, go ahead
at the top. Okay.
Yes.
You want me to read them and then okay.
Yes.
So Katharine, how do you convince people who may agree that climate change is a real problem, but deny that human activity causes climate change? That's a good one.
It is. So I would just like to say that I live in Lubbock, Texas. It is the second most politically conservative city in the entire country after Provo, Utah. And I talk to people every single day who say this. So I hear you and I know exactly what you're talking about. But let me tell you something really interesting. Through thousands of conversations, I have learned that rejecting the science of climate change is a smokescreen. Did you know that as late as the late 1990s, so 20 years ago, Republicans and Democrats were on the same page when it came to climate change?
Yeah.
Same page. There was no science denial. And we've known since the 1800s that digging up and burning coal and gas and oil are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, since the 1850s to be very precise. So where did climate denial come from? It came from the fear of action. Around about the 1990s was when we started to see the impacts of climate change. It was no longer a future issue. And once we started to see the impacts, we had to take action. And action involves weaning ourselves off fossil fuels as much as possible, as soon as possible, for the sake of all of us. And so that's when the denial machine swung into action. And I'm sorry to say, but a number of oil and gas companies literally hired spin doctors and PR experts to muddy the waters and confuse us. And in fact, there is an excellent book and movie too. It's almost the weekend, so it's a great opportunity if you haven't seen this documentary. It's called Merchants of Doubt. And it actually explains how the fossil fuel industry manufactured doubt. So today, when someone says, sure, climate is changing, but it's not humans, did they just wake up that morning and decide to reject 200 years of physics? No. They woke up in the morning and they went to Facebook or whatever social media feed or whatever news station they listen to, and they listened to people who share their values and share their concerns, and they got their opinion from them. So people don't really reject the science. What they are scared of are the solutions, because they've been told that there are no good solutions. They've been told that the only solutions are to destroy the economy and take away people's personal liberties. But when we show that climate solutions are in fact exactly the opposite, climate solutions grow jobs, build the economy, restore people's personal liberties, and actually enhance the free market, that changes people's minds. So in my book, I have the whole first part of the book actually answers your exact question, the whole first part of the book. So before I forget, I should probably put a link. Actually, when you're reading the next question, Jeannie, I'm going to put a link in the chat to where you can get the book. You can get it anywhere you want online. You can get the Audible, which I read myself. You can get an e-version book, or you can buy it in any bookstore, including Amazon. And the whole first section is, how do we have these conversations? And the answer is by starting from the heart with something that we have in common and share, connecting the dots to climate change and offering positive, constructive solutions that they can get on board with. And you might say cynically, are you sure this works? And my answer to that is yes, I have peer-reviewed science that proves it does. After I wrote the book, I did an experiment with researchers at Yale University. We created 4 short videos. And when I say short, I mean a minute and a half, that talked about how climate change solutions, there's free market solutions to climate change, that climate change affects our personal liberties, that climate change is a national security issue, and then one about how climate change relates to Christian values. These videos were recorded by a 2-time Republican congressman who runs a free market institute on climate solutions, by the head of a libertarian think tank, by a retired Air Force general, and from me, speaking both as a scientist as well as a person of faith. The Yale researchers took these short videos and they aired them on social media in real life in 3 different congressional districts. Not in a lab where you bring people in and you show them a video and you ask them if it changed their opinion. They put them out on Facebook in real life. And then they monitored public opinion in those districts. And you know what happened? Democrat levels of concern and awareness of climate change went up a bit. Republican levels of concern and awareness went up a lot. Why?
Okay.
Because they were seeing climate change from their frames.
Yeah.
Free market, personal liberties, national security, Christian faith. So yes, this approach does work. We have science that shows that it works. Not dumping fear-filled facts on people, but meeting them where they are, figuring out what makes them tick, connecting the dots between climate change impacts and what they already care about, and showing how there are positive, constructive solutions. That's how we change the minds of everybody except the 7%ers. Who are the 7%ers? I want to be very clear that there are some people whose minds we can never change. And I'm going to show you a figure that explains who those people are. Just a second here. I can share my screen, right? Yes. Here we go. So when it comes to climate change, we're not just yes or no. We're not just believers or deniers. In fact, I don't like those words for 2 reasons. First of all, it's not a religion. So believers is not a good word. And second of all, deniers is often used against people who just have questions and doubts, and who wouldn't, the way climate change is discussed in the media today. Rather, we fall along a spectrum where most of us are actually alarmed, concerned, or cautious. But there are 8% who are dismissive, who are just absolutely convinced it's a hoax and bring it up every chance they can. We can't have a positive, constructive conversation with them. Why not? Because they won't listen. And to have a positive, constructive conversation with anyone about anything, there has to be 2-way communication. And if someone's dismissive, they literally will not listen. And I have had thousands of conversations where I've tried. I just had one today. And every single time it fails. I have an uncle myself. I know people I work with who are dismissive. But you know what? They're only 8%. 92% of us are not dismissive, and that's where we can have those conversations. All right. What's the next question, Jeannie? And I'll put a link to my book in the chat while you ask it.
Okay. So I think you've kind of spoken to this, but I'm curious if it's more effective. I'm not going to move my screen. It's more effective to talk about climate change as a whole, or the more specific effects of climate change, like our health, etc., to get people to relate to the issue, especially with climate change so polarized in Montana.
Oh, B, 100%.
Yeah.
I was asked the other day, how do you tell people about polar bears and melting ice sheets in Iowa? And I said, you don't.
You don't. Yep.
In Iowa, you talk about corn and you talk about flooding.
Yep.
In Texas, you talk about wind energy and hurricanes and droughts. In Montana, you talk about wildfires and snowpack and droughts and wildfires and health and agriculture. Talk about where we live. Talk about how climate change affects us here, now, and in ways that are directly relevant to us.
That's great. Okay, we have time for one more. So many great questions.
I know.
I've heard mixed reviews about the utility of biochar in a climate change sector. Sorry, my internet is unstable. Just a second. So I've heard mixed reviews about the utility of biochar in a climate change sector, and there's a bunch of funding in the infrastructure bill for expanding biochar production out of thinned forest material. Where do you land on the costs and benefits of producing biochar? Interesting.
So I'm I'm familiar with biochar because of the research programs that they've been doing on that in Iowa for quite some time. And biochar is an excellent fertilizer. It's the whole idea of you take waste products and you pyrolyze them, or you burn them at high temperature, and the carbon comes out as kind of a gray powder, and you plow that carbon back into the soil, where it is a very, very potent natural fertilizer, and it keeps the carbon in the soil instead of the atmosphere. So if we are using waste products, it is extremely effective, because otherwise, if you just burn that waste or you let it decay, all the carbon in that waste is going to go where? Into the atmosphere. So if you're making biochar out of waste materials that would otherwise just be burned or decay, then you absolutely should make biochar and put it back in the soil. It's 100% better. Where is biochar not effective? If you're making it out of materials that otherwise would not be waste products. So if you're cutting down trees that would otherwise not be cut down to make biochar, well, the trees were already containing the carbon. The carbon was not going into the atmosphere. And so what's the point of cutting them down and making biochar and putting it in the soil? There's no point. But if you're using waste products, again, it is an excellent thing to do. And there's really no question in terms of the carbon savings. There was also a question about rangelands. So the Nature Conservancy did a fantastic analysis where they actually quantified for the United States all the different ways that could sequester carbon: rangelands, croplands, forests, wetlands. And I'll try to actually give that a quick look and put the link in the chat here so you can answer that question with detail. But do you want to fit in one more quick question while I'm doing that?
Well, okay, sure. I guess we can do one more. Let me just see. Now I've lost my, hold on. I've got too many screens here. Hold on. Let me get back to your questions. Catherine's, okay. So,
here we go.
How much is spent annually on average responding to climate-induced disasters, and how does that relate to current U.S. investment in climate action and defense spending? It's a really big question, but
it is huge. So let me just give you one example quickly. Hurricane Harvey. It caused about $125 billion in direct damages. And we know that the direct damages are historically about 10% of total damages. 10%. So you add a 0 to 125, that's $1.25 trillion. We also know that climate change was responsible for 75% of those damages. In other words, if climate change had not made that hurricane as big and strong with as much rainfall as it had, the damages would have only been 25%. So the answer is basically, in a nutshell, no. We are spending way more right now on just swimming. We're spending way more of our energy on swimming, so to speak, than we are on turning down the hose and making the drain bigger. But here's the thing. We can't keep on swimming. We have to turn off the hose. We have to make the drain bigger. And then you know what? Then we're going to be able to cope with the amount of water in the pool. So that's why we have to be doing all three, because right now we're doing only one of them, and that is not going to keep our head above water long term. We have to turn off the hose, we have to make the drain bigger, and farming and ranching and clean energy are three huge pieces. Smart agriculture and clean energy and efficiency, huge pieces of the solution, and that's what you're all about.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Katharine, for this incredibly inspiring. I mean, I've got so many things to think about, and you've put words to some stuff that I didn't have words for, and I'm sure everybody else too. And I really appreciate that our grasslands, our rangelands, and farming and ranching are part of the solution, because it doesn't seem like that message is out there a lot, but it is so key. So thank you. Now I want to tell, our everyone gathered here, that feedback is really important, and we have an evaluation form online, and I think it's going to be in the chat, because that was such a great talk, Katharine. Thank you so very much. Anyway, very excited by it now. I feel like I need to listen to it over and over again. Can't wait to see your TED Talk and look at your book.